Well, hello on this cold, frosty morning. I'm walking up St Catherine's Hill, which is just outside the historic city of Winchester. Um, Winchester has been played an important part in just about every epoch that's led to the development of what we call today that stable geopolitical entity, the country of England. It took a long time coming. And what I intend to do today is to walk up to the top of this hill first and explain when I get to the top why I'm there, and then to walk through Winchester, not only to have a look at what is an incredibly beautiful and historic city in its own right, but just to have a look at how England actually came to be. So anyway, happy walking. So here we are at the top, and looking down on the modern city of Winchester. What we do know is that about 3,000 years ago there was an Iron Age fort up here. There was about 25 tribes, native ancient Britain tribes, inhabiting these islands around the Iron Age period. And the tribe up here were probably the Atrebati. But very later on, probably around 1st or 2nd century BC, they seem to be joined by another tribe called the Belgae. The Belgae were not a Celtic tribe and not a native Britain tribe. They were actually from what was called Gaul, which is France and Belgium today. But they were from the Gallic regions, mostly those around the Low Countries. And it's probable that they came over here and it started inhabiting these parts, as like many Gallic tribes, they were under attack from the noisy neighbours in Italy called the Romans, and wanted to get away from those noisy neighbours. Anyway, it's time to get off the cold at this top of this hill and walk down into Winchester and follow the course of English history there. But before we do, there's a couple of interesting bits about the top of this hill. Just right on the top there is a copse of beautiful trees, beech trees, and they mark the point, you can just see them coming into view here, and they mark the point that where stood once a Norman chapel, built around about the 11th century, and it stood here until Henry VIII's Reformation, when, like many good things, it got vandalised and destroyed. And a few hundred years later, to mark the spot, this beautiful copse of beech trees was planted. It's quite a peaceful place, quite a lovely place to be in. The Belgae and the Atrebati were Celtic, so today this hill has some significance for the Druid community. Within the bounds of the Iron Age hill fort there was built a Celtic oppidum, which is a place where they could worship whatever they worshipped in those days. So again, another of great interest to the Druid community. So, but anyway, I'm getting off down to Winchester. I need a cup of tea to get out of this cold. Well, if the Belgae thought they could avoid the noisy neighbours by coming to Britain, that was bad news for them. The noisy neighbours followed. These walls we're following at the moment, whilst not originally Roman, were restored over the years and over the centuries, and just gives a good idea of the height and size of the Roman wall that was put around Winchester. The Romans arrived here at about 100 BC. They were building their road from east to west, from Londinium to their new place in Cyrenium, otherwise known as Cirencester, and considered this to be a rather nice little place, a confluence of lots of paths and a nice little thriving trading community run by the Belgae, and they called the place Venta Belgarum, which basically means marketplace of the Belgae. This is basically a floodplain of the River Itchen, and the River Itchen used to flow in about 4 or 5 channels or Anna branches through this area. And one of the things typical of Roman engineering was to help prevent flooding, help dry it out. They actually canalised one of the main branches, and this helped prevent the flooding, helped to dry the place out, and helped them build a very, very nice settlement here. So this was the first settlement that the Itchen navigation, a canalised section. In 4 centuries of Roman occupation, this became a very thriving, rich and wealthy community. And of course during this time the Romans did something else as well. They built other walls, and one of those walls was to define also the northern boundary of what was in time to become the country of England, when Emperor Hadrian built his wall. But anyway, back to Winchester, one can see just how in spate the River Itchen can be, and the fact that we can walk along here at all and to build anywhere around here is an absolute tribute to Roman engineering. Protected by the wars and the natural moat of the Itchen outside of those wars, Winchester developed into a very, very prosperous community indeed. When the Romans left, there was a vacuum. The ancient tribes went back to their old practices of chopping lumps out of each other, whilst incomers, the Angles and Saxons predominantly, came over to farm, to settle, to build communities. And the largest of those communities, the West Saxons, established their kingdom here in Winchester. But they were not to be left in peace, for following quickly behind them were the Vikings. And for years, war between the Vikings and the Saxons, now called Anglo-Saxons, continued until the arrival of this man. This is Alfred the Great. He fought the Saxons to a standstill, established a boundary called the Danelaw, allowed his people to live in peace, develop a society, bring in justice, prosperity, and basically an all-round good guy who deserved the title Great, although it was probably his grandson who also deserved the title Great, if not greater, for that was Athelstan, who a few years after Alfred's death defeated the Vikings once and for all in battle, drove them out of the Danelaw, defeated the northern barons that was constantly revolting against anybody they cared to revolt against, and Athelstan establishing at long last a country called England from the ancient Roman wars separating Caledonia from England down to the tip of Cornwall. I'm now going to walk through the centre of town along the lovely little high street. Left hand side is the old Guildhall building, which houses the tourist authority. Left hand side of also is the bus coming to wipe me out, so I'll just get out of its way. To the Saxons this now would have just been called Venta, but the Saxons also had a word that they called any fortified Roman town, anything with a wall, they call it Caester, which later developed into the word Chester. So this would have been Venta Caester or Venta Chester, and lovely little centre. It's closed to traffic further on, and with market stalls all the way down the middle, which we will see. I just have to pop into the tourist authority and we'll continue talking after that. As the capital of what is now England, Winchester became responsible for the centre of lawmaking. The mint was here, the financial records was here. The kings did not reside here. The Saxon kings tended to move around the country, stopping in one palace after another, doing their regal bit. And also they ruled very, very fairly, very respected. But of course, after a couple of centuries, it was all change. The new Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, acceded to the throne, contested by the Norman leader over the seas, who both had the same Scandinavian Nordic heritage. That was contested in October 1066. England changed hands. It became Norman. Upon acceding to the throne, William came to Winchester and immediately ordered two things to happen, two buildings to be erected. The first of those buildings would be the cathedral. The Saxons had a rather modest cathedral in Winchester, and William did not do modesty very well. So he ordered plans to be made for the building of the longest medieval cathedral in Europe. And we're just going to go into a music break whilst we walk there. The building on the left, by the way, is the museum, something that we will return to later because it's got rather an important plaque on it. But that's for a later epoch in history, so let's just continue walking towards the most beautiful cathedral. Under William and later kings, the bishops of Winchester became some of the most important people in the kingdom, and Winchester itself as an ecclesiastical centre was second only behind Canterbury. The second building that William was responsible for in Winchester was his castles. William was a great castle builder, and in Winchester he built not only what was a castle but also a regional palace, a regional centre of justice, and the regional assize court. So that's where we're going to go to now. We're just going to walk out of the cathedral up to Westgate and then to the Great Hall. Not much remains of the castle now, because after a few centuries of pretty much unpeaceful monarchy, we had a civil war. 1642, another great epoch that shook England to its foundations. And Winchester opted to become royalist, which was not the intention that Oliver Cromwell had for the place. So Oliver Cromwell laid siege to it. Eventually he gained access to Winchester, and in 1649 he ordered that the castle itself be taken apart. So all that remains of the castle, apart from the Great Hall, which we're going to go into in a moment, which you can see there, all that remains otherwise of the castle is the walls and the galleries beneath the castle where the walls once stood, which is this part here. So let's go into the Great Hall, the last remaining part. The Great Hall became an assize, a regional court. Prior to the Civil War, it also served as a royal palace and was in fact a favourite of Henry VIII. One of the features of the Great Hall was a reconstruction of the fabled King Arthur's Round Table, which Henry ordered to be repainted with a nice picture of the monarch on it at the top, which many believe to be Henry himself. Well, given Henry's ego, that would not surprise me. So one more tremor through the English Constitution, and that in itself would have a role to play here. 1685, the death of Charles II, the accession to the throne of James II, disputed by Charles's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, the Monmouth Rebellion, Pitchfork Rebellion, and the start of the bloody assizes to wreak revenge on those involved. And this is where we need to be making our way back to the museum. For one of those sentenced by Judge Jeffreys was Lady Alice Lisle. Alice Lisle, her husband, was quite a senior figure in Cromwell's government, part of the other house as it came to be known. She gave refuge to two escapees from the Battle of Sedgemoor, the Monmouth Rebellion. One of those was a nonconformist preacher and another was a soldier. They were captured. Alice Lisle was charged with treason, and this man here, Judge Jeffreys, duly sentenced her to death, which would have been by burning at the stake, except James II, being a terribly, terribly merciful man, commuted it to beheading. So Alice Lisle, the last woman to be beheaded in England, and she was beheaded outside the half-timbered pub in the square in Winchester. There's the plaque recording the fact. The Eclipse pub, there it is, and that's where the last woman in England was beheaded. And after that, the Pitchfork Rebellion, followed by the Glorious Revolution that sent James II packing, and England finally reached political stability. But that just about finishes this short and somewhat superficial tour of Winchester, this most fantastic historic city. And let's make my way back to my car, which is parked over to the east. I need to, of course, mention two other very famous people for which Winchester is associated. The first is possibly one of Britain's greatest classical novelists, a lady who wrote most of her novels a few miles from here, who in the later parts of her young life suffered a debilitating illness, who came to Winchester to be treated by the best doctors her family could afford, and who sadly died at the young age of 41. And that's on College Street, next to Winchester College, itself the oldest continuous school in Britain, founded by Sir John Wickham. And we're going to walk past there, and Jane Austen is of course buried in the cathedral. Her first burial was a very, very humble one. Her fame had not been known, but because she came from an ecclesiastical family, she was allowed a short burial, only 4 family members present, and it could not interrupt any services either. They had about 20 minutes to pop her into the ground. But after that, as her fame grew, they were allowed to erect a brass plaque over the place where she is buried. And when she became recognised as possibly one of the greatest literary persons we have known in this country, a stained glass window was commissioned depicting the great writers of the Bible, and above the writers of the Bible there is a depiction of St. Augustine, whose abbreviated name is Austen. So that's Jane Austen, and this is the house where she passed away. Two years after Jane Austen passed away, a young romantic poet came to Winchester for quite a long sojourn. He enjoyed his morning walks along College Close and down to the hospital of St. Cross, along the Itchen and the Water Meadows, of some of the other branches of the Itchen. And summer passed to autumn, and it was while walking down here he had the inspiration to pen his famous poem called Ode to Autumn. That was, of course, John Keats, and I'm sure we all have heard that first line of that poem, the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Well, I'm on the path of the feet of mellow sogginess. This path was recently just covered over by the Itchen. The waters have only just subsided. So I'm going to put my camera away now. I'm going to say thank you for watching. And I hope one day I could say welcome to Winchester, for it is the most beautiful, lovely, historic city. Thank you.